my pleasure today to have Andrew Cornelia on from Volta Charging. He's the chief of staff there and has had quite the illustrious career in the electric vehicle industry, working with Tesla Motors and quite a few others in the space, including some nonprofit, or I believe, what's the name of the group that you work with locally to kind of promote others in the industry?
Yeah, it's Young Professionals in Energy, shorthand YPE.
Great. Well, yeah, I would love to kind of hear a little bit about that you've been working with, along with your work at Tesla, and we can kind of go from there into what you're doing today at Volta.
Sure. Yeah. So, long and illustrious, I think, is probably an overstatement. But I'll give you a little bit of maybe my background, kind of leading up to where I am today, and how I got into energy, which was really a pretty serendipitous journey. So I actually started my career as a banker and financial service guy. Did that for about 2 years, and after I think maybe 3 or 4 kind of software trite deals, realized that banking wasn't for me, and I didn't want to be in the kind of pinstripe suits and head back to New York, which was kind of where my career was taking me. So I always had this connection to the larger idea that you could have profit with purpose. And I was always a big outdoor guy. So started thinking to myself, what could be a career that looks at the larger narrative of environmentalism, sustainability, this sort of big concept of how do you do business without just kind of profit in mind? And what would the overlap be with businesses that are looking at kind of a larger ecosystem and trying to shift this larger change. So Tesla kind of popped up for me as this one example. Mobility was one of the larger contributors to carbon emissions. I looked at that space and said, that's a great Venn diagram. Transportation tackling this larger problem, and here's this company Tesla that has a great vision, a crazy CEO, and kind of the ambition to go out and solve the problem. So I ended up at Tesla actually on the auto side. I started there for about a year before I moved over to the energy world. And for me, energy in the early days, which it used to be just stationary storage, was really this idea that, the cars were really cool, this great product, perfect product as Elon would call it. But, energy would touch a lot more industries. It had, I think, in my mind, this larger potential for impact. So that's kind of how I moved over to the energy world, which back then was, like I said, really just a battery company. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think what's really interesting is when you look at the framework when it comes to a lot of the people who work at Tesla and then Google, and actually quite a few more tech-focused companies, it is usually a much more engineer-focused kind of hiring group. And obviously finance does have some pretty interesting roles that plays, especially around utilities and energy. But are there some things that you can kind of share with how you were able to kind of step into that role with the finance background and really bring some kind of unique insights to the team there?
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, the lens that I looked at, finance through at Tesla was actually a unique one. So, Tesla runs their finance organization almost like an internal consulting arm for the business. And we were all this mix between, ex-consultants, ex-bankers, ex-engineers who were wearing these sort of FP&A business operations hats. And the way that we would kind of run the business was you would pair one of us with the leader of a business to essentially create this sort of, marriage of, separation of church and state. You had the business leader who said, here's my strategy, here's how I view my business vertical. And then you had finance who would come in and say, I don't see it that way. Let me push back in a healthy way. So, it was an interesting way, especially early in a career, to, have that sort of opportunity to come into a business, partner with a business leader, and help them shape their P&L. So, the way that I kind of approach at least the energy side of the business, and to your point, finance is a very complicated world when it comes to energy kind of systems, energy markets, utilities. There's a lot of inside baseball kind of lingo. But I approached it because I took over the charging business pretty early in my tenure on the energy finance team, was through the lens of, standalone P&L. And actually that was, one of my hunches way back when, was that charging could be a business. And that's kind of how I managed my, 3.5-year tenure, working on the charging side of the business at Tesla, which was, this is a great opportunity for Tesla. This has really helped them accelerate the EV adoption of vehicles. But what else can we do with this business arm? We have this massive network, we have this massive driver base, but how do we think about top line revenue growth? How do we think about margin profiles? How do we think about new revenue line items other than just pay per use? So it was kind of, through that lens of how do you manage this as a standalone business that gave me a little bit of my early insight to the charging landscape.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned in our conversation previously was how really the rollout of these superchargers and kind of the galleries and the stores at first, by being in malls, that was all kind of part of Tesla's take on marketing and advertising. Can you kind of share a little bit more about how with the supercharger that was approached and how that really brought visibility pretty early on to the vehicles there?
Yeah, for sure. So I remember actually one meeting with Elon where he asked this question, and I swear that this is relatable. He asked, why do people buy cars? And it was like, somewhat of a hypothetical question, but I think a few people tried to answer it, and he was like, nope. He's like, people buy cars because cars represent freedom, and that's a fundamentally important concept because Tesla was looking to build out a supercharger network, not because of the fundamental kind of need, but more because of the desire and the want. And the want is related to really this sort of like social psychology and what people call range anxiety. It's the idea that, if I'm buying a car, I want the freedom to drive anywhere and I don't want to be stranded on the side of the road. The kind of want of that is very different than the need, which is, the majority of our driving happens within, I'd say, 5 to 10 miles of our homes. Those sort of like trips to grandma that like, grandma's one state away or to the mountain to go skiing. Those happen, I think, few and far between. But that sort of, let's build the network so people have that sense of security. That was very much a marketing pitch for Tesla early in the days. Hey, you can drive across the country. And oh, by the way, we did it in one of our roadsters. How cool is that? Come buy our car.
Yeah, and we're looking at others. I mean, Volta obviously is a player in that space, but you look at like Electrify America, who's now just, I believe it's kind of through the South, but has now kind of made that continental travel possible.
Yeah. I mean, Electrify America is an interesting example because I don't even consider them a company. I mean, they are, a bailout fund that is pretty inefficiently deploying capital. So, I think they are a kind of product of still this sort of, gas-like thinking versus electric vehicle thinking. And I can explain a little bit further on that. So, today, and I think supercharger network is one example of this, and it's one solution to the larger problem of how do you build infrastructure for electric mobility. And the answer isn't always going to be with DC fast, and it's not always going to be faster and bigger is better. And Electrify America is kind of playing into that same hand that the supercharger network was building. And they're not doing it through this sort of network intelligent, kind of design oriented way. I mean, one example is, Electrify America's average utilization on a per month basis is like 15 to 20 charge sessions per day. We have that in 2 days on our sites. Right. So, I mean, their kind of deployment and efficiency in deployment of capital is abysmal. I mean, just kind of like, straight down the pipe. So, it's definitely a similar view, I think, as Tesla. But again, Tesla is kind of, branding it as a marketing arm of the business. EA is, trying to spend capital as quickly as they can because they have to.
Gotcha. And then I know one of the other things you mentioned is looking at the data that kind of drives Volta's decisions compared to others. Is there any of that you kind of, as you kind of progress your career from Tesla, that you were able to really see pretty quickly how that is going to be the future of where electric vehicle charger is going to go in? It's not always, it's easy to kind of put it along I-5 or these different interstates, but some of these kind of interesting data points and maybe counterintuitive things that you've come across.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I honestly think so, I kind of went back to this idea that, during my tenure at Tesla, I was thinking about the supercharger business through this lens of, the P&L and saying, this could be a business on its own. And that hunch actually brought me to Volta, and I'll kind of answer the data question, in a long-winded way. But Volta's approach to EV charging is unique, and it's this data-driven approach that I think adds value to charging as a sustainable business model that kind of carries through all of the evolutions of EV adoption. So, data is, a buzzword in, Silicon Valley, and everyone uses it when describing any sort of technology. It's
data, the data, the cloud, that's where all the money is,
There's
right?
data ponds, there's data lakes, there's data puddles, like however you want to describe it. But really what we do with data is support our thesis on EV charging. And our thesis on EV charging is really actually kind of described with one question. And the question is, to be to be a leading player in the EV charging market, there's really only one question that you have to answer. And that one question is, can EV charging sell spaghetti?
Tell me more.
So it sounds funny. It sounds somewhat non sequitur and non-related, but it's hugely related, and it connects to data. So I'll tell you how. So right now, like I said, everyone is building this sort of analogous offering to gas stations. Everyone is looking at fueling infrastructure as a transactional agreement between grid, network operator, and EV driver, and what they're transacting are electrons. And electrons fundamentally are pretty commoditized. There isn't a lot of value in selling electrons. However, if you look at this sort of larger infrastructure that exists, that's being disrupted with fueling infrastructure moving from gas to electric, you see that there's about $400 to $500 billion per year spent on retail gas. That is the opportunity that is up for large, and that is shifting as we move to electric mobility. However, only about half of that is related to retail gas sales. The other half is related to what people consider Cokes and smokes. It's the convenience model. So there is a ton of value that is being left on the table by every other EV charging company. So the way that we think about data is we think about data that supports a business model that is based on monetizing behavior over electrons. And really what we're looking at is that there is a shift in behavior around this transition that will change how cities are designed. It will change where people go. It will change how electric grids are built and planned for. It will change how commerce and retail are defined. And we're looking at creating an ecosystem, which is really that fueling infrastructure of the future, and using data to support this behavioral shift to show where value is, and using data to connect all of these disparate parties, one being EV drivers, another being site partners, another being our media partners, another being utility partners, and showing them that we deliver value. And data is, again, kind of the proof point of that. And that value we then can monetize. And that's really our business model. We monetize behavior over electrons. And that kind of answers this silly question of, can EV charging sell spaghetti? Yes, because we can bring an EV driver to your store, and then we can map that behavior from their visit to the store and them buying spaghetti and adding value to the bottom line of a Whole Foods.
And that makes sense when you look at what the needs are of most drivers. I mean, it goes to sometimes the road trip example. Yep. But what I would be interested in is, especially when you kind of look at where people are actually charging, and I think the big question people always have is they go back to this analogy of gas, and they talk about the speed at which you charge.
Yeah.
And what's kind of interesting when you look at Volta and even looking at Tesla, one of the big things they first announced was originally they talked about superchargers, but really what took off is their destination chargers, not nearly as fast, but they're places where they're convenient and people start or stop for an extended period so they can get what they need anyway. Is there kind of any of that inside of where those make more sense than the fast charging that you can kind of share with us? And that's what is also leading how Volta approaches the speed of charging?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that comes down to the fundamental concept that in the future, people they're not going to go out of their way to fuel, which is how we fuel today, right? I mean, a gas station is always, granted they're on the corners, in major intersection, but we have to stop our day to really go fuel. In the future, that will be kind of reversed. It will be, we are fueling where we're already going. So, this idea of Everything needs to be a supercharger. Everything needs to be 150 kilowatt power output to 250 kind of nameplate. Like it's silly because, depending on where you're going, you may be there for a longer period of time. So if you're going, let's say, to the movies, and I know that sounds kind of foreign these days, right? Like
Right.
movies is like sitting on your couch and watching Netflix. You're going to plug your car in and you're going to be charging for 2 hours. If you have a 250 kilowatt or 150 kilowatt power DC fast, then you're essentially having your car sit there idle, not using the station for an hour and 20 minutes because you've charged already to the top in 40 minutes. So the way that we think about charging at Volt is, charging output, charging power, charging product really should match the sort of, behavior that you want to see at any given site. So if you're, at a grocery store where, your average shopping experience is 45 minutes, you should have a charging option that gives you kind of optimal charge, and not usually 100%, but optimal charge for that time period. If you're at a coffee store, it should be 15 to 20 minutes. If you're at a movie theater, it should be your 2 hours. And I think, there will always be a need for this sort of diversified asset portfolio where you do have kind of the higher power outputs, because maybe you have a retail center that's close to the highway and you're pulling in traffic and they want to stop quickly to keep going onto their next destination. But I think the idea of what is that ratio, I think we have oversized our network to think that fast is the only solution. And I think as we move into this world where people become more educated about EV charging and how to use electric vehicles, which is very much like your cell phone, right? You plug it in when there's available charging and you don't worry that your phone is going to drain. Very rarely do you charge it from 0 to 100, and you do that while you're sleeping. So I think, as we move more towards this sort of electric transportation flip, people will have that knowledge, and that idea that you don't need fast all the time will become more ubiquitous.
Gotcha. And I think one of the things you did kind of mention was obviously the example of going to movie theaters and some of these things that are clearly being impacted. It's short term, but yeah, things that are, at least hopefully, but things that are being impacted by COVID. What are there any sorts of interesting kind of trends that you've seen around that, or any maybe hurdles that are kind of people are pushing back on seeing the long-term value of investing in EV infrastructure right now?
I think there's a little bit of, placement. I mean, I think people, yes, immediately following, kind of COVID, people drove their cars a little less because they weren't commuting to work. They weren't, leaving their house as much. There were shelter in place provisions. What we found was actually little impact to our network. We have a pretty robust network, and we look to partner kind of across different portfolio verticals. So 80% of our locations were actually considered kind of close, and close is actually 1,300 feet to an essential service business. So there was actually very little impact when kind of the world shut down to our business model. We saw, some depression in charge levels just because, again, some of those kind of people were staying home, but people still need to go to the grocery store. And if you're driving your electric vehicle, you still need to charge. So, our model is pretty resilient to that based on where we put our locations. I think longer term, your question on the investor side is a really interesting one. I think if you look at the market, I mean, today, yesterday, the day before, it's like every headline is, electric vehicle company gets multi-billions of dollars of investment, Rivian, SPAC supporting Fisker. A couple months ago, it was Germany and France putting in these sort of, federal mandates to support electrification. So I think there's actually, this acceleration to the transition that's happening right now. And I'm super excited to see that. I mean, that supports Volta, but that also supports kind of, the underlying mission that I support, which is this transition to electric mobility.
Gotcha. And I mean, that does make sense, because even with car sales in general, everything's down, but it seems like just even globally, electric vehicles are kind of the one area that's not as down as much.
But yeah, Elon Musk is the 7th richest man in the world. Tesla's valued more than Exxon, and Rivian, who hasn't sold a car yet or really doesn't have any production vehicles on the line, just raised $2.5 billion. So yeah, it's an interesting time.
Definitely. I mean, kind of going off of that, what are some of the as you've seen going through this, that obviously Volta is growing. There's really kind of an interesting approach that they're taking compared to others. Can you share what are some of the traditional or some of the challenges that the traditional charging networks you already have, but anything else that's kind of worth noting and you've noticed in your career that the traditional charging networks are kind of coming up against?
Yeah, I mean, I think, EV charging is an interesting game. You know, Tesla, the way that they built their model, I mean, they're kind of building this completely new product, right? Like, yes, a car is a car. We understand it has four wheels and a steering wheel, and this is how it goes. You push down a pedal and it moves forward. But the way that they were designing it was completely different. They were looking at a completely different drivetrain, completely different technology for fueling, a completely different design aesthetic and user interface, and all the above, kind of rethinking how a car worked, like this new technology. Charging is not really, you don't really need to kind of innovate that much on it. Yes, you can innovate to get higher power output, and your charging equipment can look that much kind of sexier, but really it's about conduit that connects power generating asset to transmission and distribution through a cord to a car, and that's it. Really, I think fundamentally what kind of attracts me to the charging space is that connective tissue between energy and vehicle and mobility, and it involves kind of construction and these kind of small scale projects that you need to manage across a whole network. So to do that, it's not this sort of push a button, download a software package and the product's ready, or push something off a manufacturing line, it's there. It involves planning, it involves permitting, it involves installation, it involves union labor, it involves putting shovels in the ground and digging dirt. So what I think is interesting with kind of charging right now is it requires people to somewhat build ahead and kind of arms race towards this land grab mentality of how do we get the right locations. And again, there's different thoughts on what the right location is, but if people have kind of the same thesis, or even if they don't, how do you go get the right locations today so that you have them tomorrow and you start building this network? In order to do that, and if you're doing that with invested capital, you can't just sit on dollars without giving $1 back or $1.25 back to your investor base. So how do you have a business model that really kind of monetizes over every single EV adoption phase and continues to grow as the kind of EV adoption rates increase and as this sort of mobility or new mobility ecosystem evolves? And I think that's really what's interesting about Volta. And this is actually one of my earlier conversations with Scott, who is our co-founder and CEO, was, Volta's business model is just that. It was built to really understand how to monetize day one, where we are somewhat still in this trough of EV adoption rates. But then, like a flywheel or, compounding variable, like it grows and picks up speed as the market goes up to the right. So that's where I think there's this sort of like interesting dynamic at play.
And with that, it is kind of interesting because in concept, people always see like, okay, all you're doing is taking the energy from the grid, putting in an electric vehicle. Seems straightforward enough. But you did kind of hit some of the challenges that I don't think people fully always realize how sensitive they can be, especially around permitting.
Yeah.
And all sorts of other kind of fun and underrated challenges that you run into. Are there any areas that, given the locations that Volta chooses because of the data that you found, kind of helps streamline that? Because it does seem to be usually in areas that already probably have a pretty high electrical load, but at the same time, since you're not doing as many fast charging stations, that might be able to help speed up that process.
Yeah, that's definitely one way that we go faster, is that we are not pulling in massive power draws. We're not having to drop a transformer and pull in different kind of utility connections. So that helps for sure. But you said it right, like permitting. So like if you ask me like what my wish list of what needs to change to really help accelerate the adoption of infrastructure for electric mobility, some of the municipal kind of just general hurdles that you have to jump through. I think this is with any construction project. you know, permitting is kind of a pain in the butt. And, you know, it was less of a pain in the butt in California because you'd go into these, you know, conversations, and it could even be, you know, just general education. So whether it be a site partner, whether it be a permitting official, whether it be, you know, someone else in the sort of like value chain, you know, people understand what electric mobility is, what EV charging is. But as you kind of work to these new markets, it becomes a little bit harder to get over some of those hurdles. Things are shifting, but that's definitely still, you know, something that we talk about a lot internally.
I mean, right now, would you say that is probably taking up the majority of the time, is the permitting versus like trying to get any sort of other kind of construction or maybe even utility related things set up?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely one of the larger time sucks for the business, is the permitting side, is some of the sort of, you know, pre-work to installation. Because once you start digging, it's a relatively easy construction job. For us, it's also, you know, we care a lot about that station placement, that siting. And we really pride ourselves on the relationships that we've created with our larger portfolio companies. So, you know, one of the kind of, you know, things I mentioned was, you know, our somewhat resiliency to COVID, in that we had so many of these essential service locations. You know, we have these larger MSAs, these larger portfolios with, you know, Walgreens and with Whole Foods and Brookfield. And, you know, if you look at kind of the grocery store network, you know, I can't mention all of them, but, you know, kind of in conversation is upward of 60% of the total available market of all grocery stores. So, you know, not to say we have those installed, but, you know, we have MSAs, or we're in conversation at the parent level with a lot of these with a lot of these companies, with a lot of these larger kind of holding organizations that have those locations. So that takes some time for us as well, because we are not in the game of let's go after the minnows. We care much more about building the long-term relationships with the parent companies, with the REITs, with the larger companies, so that we can have that full banner.
And with them, I mean, totally makes sense. With them, what are those kinds of conversations like? Is it kind of go back to what you were talking about earlier, that EV chargers sell spaghetti and they kind of get that? Or can these conversations kind of span the gamut of what really builds their interest in kind of committing to these projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit of all of the above. I mean, you know, the pithy kind of can EV charging sell spaghetti is really important, and I'll come back to that. But really, I think, you know, retail at large is changing, right? And, you know, we're seeing that with COVID, and I think that's accelerating some of, you know, what's happening, and that, you know, much more retail is happening from your computer, from your couch, you know, shopping. Things are mostly pickup these days. But before that shift, before the sort of like abrupt change, you know, it was really, you know, retail was shifting away from brick and mortar, and it was really kind of requiring more of this sort of amenity and service offering. It wasn't this sort of transactional, just kind of purchase, right? Because if you need a pair of shoes, go on Amazon, buy your pair of shoes there. But you go to the Stanford Shopping Mall because it has a great outdoor space. You have your favorite coffee spot. You know, you can charge your car. So you have all these kind of amenities and services built in. So really, you know, part of the conversation with these site partners is thinking about retail for the future, and it's built around that amenity offering. And then it comes down to the conversation which underpins our business model of, you know, if you are a equivalent grocery store, and now I'm going to use this as an example, and your grocery store is right across the street from each other, how do you pull traffic or wallet share from one place to the other? Is it because you have a better brand of Cheerios in the other place? Is it because, you know, your bathrooms are cleaner? It's all based on kind of the offering and the service amenities, and that sort of ability to attract people into your location is really important. And one of actually, like, I think it was maybe 6 months ago, maybe 9 months ago at this point, Electric had written an article about Volta in one of our partnerships. And there was a quote in that literally said by a woman that had been interviewed for this article that, I love Volta. I decided to leave my, you know, X, Y, and Z grocery store and go to Whole Foods because Volta was there. And because we offer free charging, you know, that amenity is very valuable to people as they're going and kind of performing their shopping experience. So that is definitely something that we talk to our site hosts about. And that is a valuable amenity that pulls people in and then also keeps them there, right? Because again, back to this idea that charging should match the desired, not necessarily the exact behavioral time that someone is in a store, but the desired time. If you can keep someone in a store 5 minutes longer, 10 minutes longer than they normally would have been, that equates to more wallet share, more basket size uplift, and that's valuable to a site host.
Gotcha. And with a lot of the examples you've shared are kind of like the retail spaces, which definitely makes sense. Are you seeing this from like maybe more traditional business parks or anything like that as well, where maybe they can just, once again, just be another advantage to essentially a perk for working at a company? Or is it much more around that kind of business model around like retail where there's a clear transactional use case?
No, I think, I mean, you're spot on, right? And that's a different vertical for sure. I mean, you have home, which is a vertical, and, you know, people are tackling that. You have workplace and, you know, your office parks or kind of larger, kind of like banks of charging units. And then you kind of have, you know, public retail. We're kind of squarely in that public retail space. Not to say that we haven't talked about some of these other industries. We just think that the opportunity in the public space is really large, and that's kind of where we're focusing our game right now. But this idea of office park or other semi-public charging becomes really interesting as more cars come on the road, as kind of the fleet operations becomes more of a reality. So it's definitely, there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, and I totally get that. It seems more like the longer term play, just because for a lot of people who might not be able to buy EVs now, kind of down the road, the big thing not only becomes when you buy it, where can you charge it? And workplace charging is kind of a secondary issue if you live in an apartment or a condo where that's not a possibility.
Yeah. And I mean, part of our business model, again, kind of, you know, as we think about it evolving over time is, you know, one of the ways that we monetize in the early days is with media assets on all of our locations. You know, workplace is valuable in that it is that perk. It is something that, you know, maybe attracts or retains an employee to a certain job. But that sort of kind of semi-private, semi-public domain isn't as valuable to us because, you know, we don't have as much influence over behavior. I mean, it's great for, again, the Googles, Facebooks, Teslas of the world, because it is that sort of perk, but it's not great for kind of this ecosystem that we're trying to build.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And going off that, you've shared kind of a lot about your background, your career in charging, and what Volta does. Can you share a little bit more about your role specifically as chief of staff at Volta, and maybe what your day-to-day looks like there?
Yeah, sure. So it's an interesting role, and it's defined, I think, differently depending on who you ask it. You know, this chief of staff role across other organizations. My role in particular is really kind of an extension of our CEO. And I help kind of fill bandwidth gaps or scope gaps that he may have. So, you know, I lean a lot on my finance background and operations background, and help Scott, who is this visionary guy, kind of translate his vision into execution. And we joke around that it's, you know, order from his chaos. And he understands, you know, I mean, I say it like jokingly, like he understands exactly what's going to happen in the industry, his viewpoint on how the world changes and how electric mobility is going to be a large part of that. Like, I'm on board, I'm sold. It's now, how do we take that and how do we boil it down into its manageable pieces? So that's kind of where I come in. You know, I work within our C-suite and provide connective tissue between Scott and Chris Wendell, who's our president. You know, work very closely with our CFO and our CRO, and help manage within that group, and then also play connective tissue down to the individual team. So help kind of understand, you know, what's going on, boots on the ground, both from the individual contributor level all the way up to SVP, all the way back up to C-suite. It's a balance, I would say, between half operational, half strategic advisor. And as just kind of an example of a few things, you know, where I'm focusing these days, my time is mostly spent on our new financing round, as a kind of like one major area right now. The other is really through kind of a corporate development lens of how do we think about diversified revenue streams and diversified partnership models. And then the third one is much more operational, and it's looking more in-house and saying, as an organization, we're growing. How do we figure out what we want to focus on? So it's standing up our own version of kind of an OKR framework and making sure that we have the right goals and the right priorities, and we have the right metrics and numbers and reporting to track that performance over time.
Gotcha. And I mean, that also kind of goes to your involvement kind of locally in the Bay Area with like the young professionals energy. And Can you share some of what that group is working on and kind of areas where there's overlap with that and kind of what you're trying to do in your own career and others down in the Bay Area?
Yeah, the YPE, Young Professionals in Energy, it's a national organization, and there's chapters in every major city. So there's one in New York, there's one in Houston, there's one in San Francisco, one in LA. It's definitely depends on where you are. The lean towards how you interpret energy might be a little different. So the Houston YPE is a little dirtier than the San Francisco YPE, if you ask me. But it's great. So when I was joining Tesla Energy, energy is a hard world to break into. It seems like the people who know it really well, and the terminology and the markets and the dynamics, it's confusing. So I reached out to a buddy of mine back in the day who was going to a bunch of these YPE events, and he had recommended that I kind of tag along, and it opened my eyes to a whole new world of industry verticals, business roles, because there's lawyers, there's bankers, there are investors, there are operational people, there are engineers, there are founders, et cetera, as well as just general ways to plug in. So YPE is a young professional organization that focuses on content events as well as networking events. So about once a month, twice a month, we host events, no longer kind of in-person social events, but we're starting to do some Zoom events, as well as content events that highlight different areas of the marketplace. So we did one on kind of the impact from COVID on energy markets. We've done past events with people like Jigar Shah, who's the founder and one of the managing directors of I'm blanking an investment firm in energy in the Bay Area. We've done one that's coming up actually with Dan Sugar, who's the founder of Nextracker. So it's a bunch of these sort of educational networking events that highlight different areas of the energy industry.
And I guess just out of curiosity, what is the best way for someone to follow up and kind of learn more about it if they're interested in seeing if there's something locally or just attending these events? I'm assuming virtually in the short term.
Yeah. I mean, people should definitely get involved. More than happy to have people reach out directly to me, but probably the best way to do it is go on our website, YPE Bay Area, or Google search YPE San Francisco, and it's the first one that pops up. We actually spent some time to make sure that we were the first one to pop up. So we have a whole event calendar on there. I think the next event that we have is this conversation with Dan Sugar, kind of a fireside chat from a CEO in the energy world. So should be a great opportunity. And then I know we have a few kind of Zoom networking events coming up as well. So
that's great. I think what's kind of interesting, obviously, is, as you mentioned earlier, all of these different things really are intertwined, and you kind of have to have a pretty strong base understanding of the different systems and what value that each needs to kind of first be met for other things to all start working together, or at least get something rolling. And kind of speaking of those other systems, one of the things you also mentioned previously I found really kind of fascinating is the work Volta is doing with utilities and kind of leveraging the network tool, that how you've kind of talked about not only your first party, but some third party information and kind of some of the things that have come out of that. Can you elaborate a little bit more and share more of that information?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think, like I said, one of our kind of underlying points of our business is this sort of data layer. And, Volta, kind of taking a step back, we understand how the market is evolving. We do that with data. So data kind of shows us what the industry forecast looks like. It shows what the future demand will be from an EV driver standpoint. We also, because we have other ways to monetize our network, and we don't believe in the sort of value that electrons deliver in kind of the industry today, we have a free charging service. So we have a very pure understanding of EV driver demand. It really leads to having higher utilization. So we have one of the highest utilizations per port in the whole industry. And it really gives us that pure data lake of what does EV driver usage, demand, behavior look like today, and over the last 10 years that we've been doing this. That data is immensely valuable to utilities, because utilities and utility grid systems are really this sort of equation of supply equals demand, right? They are always trying to balance what is the demand on the grid with what is our supply. And they have, kind of the base load, they have sort of intermediary loads, and then they have, peaker plants that go up and down to balance this. And they have smarter people than I am kind of regulating and trading into future markets and complicated stuff, but it's all supply equals demand in my simple mind. As kind of utilities think about planning for the future, and we're talking about, billions of dollars of capital deployment over the next, 10 years, they need to know what is supply and demand. So where we come in is this sort of understanding and this sort of, expert on how EV driving has contributed to demand on the grid over time and how it will continue to contribute is what we've productized. And we've productized this in this really slick tool called the network planning tool. And it was built by Praveen Mandal, who is actually the co-founder of ChargePoint and who's now our CTO. So this idea that we have, a machine learning tool that kind of powers our machine intelligent network that we can then go out and productize and sell to utilities to help with their power planning is hugely valuable. So we've partnered already with a few utilities, some from our cap table, and have had conversations with a number of other ones, and are now talking to them about how we can help them figure out where to put their energy systems, their assets, their T&D, their transmission distribution over time so that they're ready for this exponential curve in EV adoption rates. And that's just our first customer. So, we see that this sort of data set, understanding the mobility kind of forecast, being able to scenario plan off of this, being able to report out on ESG stats and sort of macro stats around mobility is going to be hugely valuable. And it's going to be valuable for utilities. It's going to be valuable for governments, municipalities, for OEMs, for fleets, for financial services. So, this sort of data approach, again, it's a buzzword, but it's very much a very important part of our business that we're starting to productize and monetize in a very real way.
And I think that's kind of what plugs into, as you mentioned, there's also a third party thing to it. So people who are interested in this, it's not just Volta's data and what their usage, and they're getting a much larger kind of spectrum of EV usage and kind of adoption across the country, correct?
No, yeah, and that's a great point. So yeah, it is not just kind of our own first party data. We connect our first party data with third party data. And, the special sauce is kind of how we connect that stuff and the tool itself. But it is a larger reaching view of mobility than just our network. So, we've been having some of these early conversations with investors and with some of these utility partners. And we built this tool, and it's amazing. The woman who's managing it, worked at PG for years and years and years, so understands the utility markets, has done a great job standing up this tool and, kind of early demos of what it looks like. And the output and product is super powerful.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked a little bit now about the software side of ChargePoint. I'm sorry, not ChargePoint, but obviously Volta. Yep. But we've kind of alluded to what the hardware is as well. Can you share a little bit more about that? I know it's primarily level 2, correct? And then there are kind of a handful of the DC fast chargers. Is there really kind of anything unique or special about on the hardware side of what Volta's working on right now?
So we do not build our own charging hardware. We build the unit itself, and it is a mix, to your point, of level 2 and DC fast. So we have a full suite of charging services. We also have what we call charging towers, which are really pedestals, so kind of non-media units. So as a site evolves over time and, we're done putting media stations on a property, we also have that sort of, pedestal solution. And it's, analogous to kind of the workplace charging where you have a bunch of pedestals stacked. What is really interesting is, again, we have one of the highest utilizations in the industry. Electrify America, put stations in and they're used maybe once a day, half a time a day, if you look at the math. So what we've actually found is we are a great test case for how poor the hardware is in the EV charging world. It has not been built through a robust kind of QA. Here's how you build a product that's going to be used and abused and used and abused. So what we're finding actually is there isn't really great EV charging hardware equipment out there that can really stand up to the test of time. So we are assembling our product, and that is something we're exploring as well. But the kind of nameplate is we offer level 2 DC fast. We offer again, what solution kind of fits the use case for our side partners.
No, and I that's kind of exactly what I assume. I just want to clarify, and it makes sense because that's where I've really seen what you've positioned in our discussions is really on the software side.
Yep.
And it does kind of seem to be a bit of a, I don't know, I'm trying to think. I mean, you could use all sorts of like Android phone or other analogies from other charging technologies, where it's not really breakthrough. It's just maybe something has a slightly better spec sheet. But when you come to actual usage and impact for the average EV driver, it's kind of nil. Whereas seeing that higher uptime is really showing that these are being used.
Yeah, and it's interesting again, like to look back kind of at Tesla's model, like Elon was all about perfect product. It was all about the car would speak for itself, right? He didn't do any advertising or any marketing because the car spoke for itself. You push down the accelerator pedal and it goes faster than your 911, your 912, like done, I'm sold. That was like a product focused world. You have then the service focused world of an Airbnb or whoever it is who says, our service offering is disruptive, but it's better than anyone else in the marketplace. Really the way that we look at kind of, our unit is this sort of ecosystem. And it's interesting because, hardware is kind of commoditized in our mind. Again, we talked about it really just being the sort of conduit that connects grid system to car. Like, great, if you have an awesome, EV charging hardware product, we'll buy it, we'll use it, we'll tell you how to make it better. We don't think there's a good business there. We also don't think there's a great business in just kind of this software piece as well. It's really about creating this ecosystem. The way I think about it is almost like we are this linchpin in this ecosystem that if you pull this out, it would fall apart. Because what we do is we connect EV charging to the ability to sell spaghetti. Like, how you do that any other way without Volta in this sort of model doesn't exist. So really the business model and how this business model evolves over the EV adoption curve is kind of what we consider the unit or the, kind of what we productize.
And when people are kind of listening about Volta and where they can find it, it sounds like probably the software package that you guys are presenting to the utilities might be on a national scale, or maybe even like most of North America, or what is kind of the scale, and where can people find Volta chargers, at least in the US? Or is there plans to kind of go beyond that currently?
Yeah, step number one, download our app. And we have the full map solution, and it's a great map finder in terms of what stations are near you. Our build out has been in most major cities. So San Francisco has a really big network, LA, Boston, New York, Dallas, Austin, Seattle, et cetera. And that's really our business model, is kind of building in the intra-urban markets and building out a city and then expanding to the next one. So our growth is really focused on North America and the US here at first. The focus is hitting national network scale over the next year. And that's really where our growth trajectory is taking us. And that's really why we're kind of out to market right now, is building that national network. So go to our app, go on our website, find one of our stations. And if you don't have an electric car, then go buy one. And then use one.
That might be better to do that first before the app, I guess.
Yeah, there are enough cars out there. We used to always joke. This is actually like a very serious point. Is there are three things that need to happen for EV adoption to really take off. One is you need to build a sexy car. Like Tesla, check, has done that. Rivian, those are cool looking cars. Bollinger, which is another kind of boxy looking EV cars. Like there are different takes on EV vehicles, and they're starting to look good. The other is price parity. And it's not total cost of ownership price parity, because that is a hard thing to sell to anyone. And if you're a car salesman, it's going to be even harder. But total cost of ownership is nice. It's really purchase price parity on your kind of sticker price. And that's going to happen within 36 months. And then the other one is charging infrastructure. So, this EV adoption kind of flip, as I call it, is going to happen sooner than later. So if you don't have an EV vehicle today, you will have one. Is essentially the
Yeah.
just.
Well, as people start hopefully buying more EVs, or if they already have them, one of the things that has really stood out is obviously the functionality of charging apps has been huge for EV drivers in the past, but you are starting to see this trend. Obviously, Tesla offered it natively, Mercedes, and I believe even Rivian's kind of looking at including it directly into their infotainment. Have you guys had any discussions around working with OEMs to kind of help build that in, or is it maybe too early to discuss that?
I would say it's definitely part of the conversation. And that is, I mean, if you look at Tesla, they're doing, the vertically integrated solution where they're going to focus on building everything themselves. Other OEMs are not going that route, right? I mean, a lot of them are sort of laggards to this electrification. Others are similar to Tesla in that, they're starting from scratch. Rivian, Lucid, Fisker, which is kind of a remake of, an old company.
Yeah.
But, Polestar, which is kind of a hybrid, right? Part of, Volvo subsidiary, but, kind of doing their own thing as well. So there are going to be needs to integrate with OEMs. And it's looking, I mean, there's still this battle of, what is the standard, both from kind of a plug as well as from, right, onboard integration. So that conversation is still ongoing, but there will be a need for OEMs to have these conversations with multiple EV charging operators. And we are actively involved in this.
That's great to hear, because I think for me, that's been one of the big conversations around EVs is, and it kind of goes back to what you were talking about, just making the best product. And currently nowadays, when you're driving, you kind of have to figure out, I mean, it's not, to be honest, it's not that hard because there's so many gas stations, but you have to figure out where you're going to pull over to do it.
Yeah.
And I think the situation that makes it better is if you're going on these longer road trips, having that just kind of built in, or if you're, I mean, it also becomes a thing, even if you're not looking to really charge that much or whatever the case might be, inherently something will stand out to people if they don't have to pay.
Yeah.
And that is going to make them drive a little bit extra or go farther to have that interaction and be able to charge there. I realize since we're kind of coming up to near the end of the hour here, I am a little curious also to just learn a bit more about, you've mentioned already areas around ways that maybe permitting can help. Are there any other kind of topics that in your experience could really help streamline the rollout of chargers, whether that be government regulation, that be private industry, or just things that you've seen in your career, given that you've kind of worked not only for Tesla, but what you're seeing in your role at Volta to really help grow chargers and just the EV community in general?
Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously, the acceleration of EV adoption and just the availability of EV options will accelerate the infrastructure world, right? It's, this chicken and the egg that needs to kind of balance, and you want infrastructure to be the leader to cars because it's supporting the base of cars that you're putting on the road, but it can't be too far out in front. So there is always this balance of, yes, you want to build infrastructure because the cars are coming, but like, when are the cars coming? And the cars are coming now. So I think that will help. And that is a kind of a trend that, is controllable maybe, but it's kind of unfolding. I think another interesting one, we talked a little bit about this, kind of at the top of the hour, was, Electrify America is a federal bailout. Like, they are, they have a couple $2 billion where they need to put capital in the ground, and they're putting capital in the ground in a way that is maybe not the most efficient use of it. So, if you look across the different industries, whether they be utilities with make ready programs or rebate programs, if you look at, federal kind of incentives, whether it be kind of tax credits or other programs, if you look at, OEMs and, their commitment to infrastructure investments, I think the question comes down to, where are you putting your capital in the most efficient way with the highest return potential? And what I mean by highest return potential is actually what is the investment that will give you the most miles delivered per dollar invested? And that's where I think people need to really pay attention to the business models and the sort of, thesis of how EV charging evolves over time. Because again, if you go back to Electrify America, which they are just deploying capital and putting charging stations in because they have to, they're not really planning for this sort of EV adoption rate where utilization really matters. That I think is a huge component of all of this, right? Like, we need to build networks intelligently, and we need to build networks to kind of use the Wayne Gretzky quote of, build to where the puck is going to be, not where the puck is today. And that's where I think that will really help not only accelerate, but also make sure that we're building the right network for tomorrow.
No, I think that's great to hear. And I completely agree. Yeah. I think the best way to measure it isn't, as you said, always about ROI. It's really about uptime. And it reminds me of like the aviation industry. Every time a plane's on the ground, it's losing money.
Oh, for sure.
And you want to have it up in the air. And that's kind of been the thing I've seen with so many of these charging infrastructure or charging companies is they're doing really cool things. They're putting them in cool places or kind of making certain routes available. But if people aren't using them, okay, well, it's a lot of great marketing, a lot of money spent, but has that really accomplished the mission?
For sure. So I think that's huge. I mean, if we can have that be the case, then we'll have the network in place to support, the cars that are going to be on the road, sooner than later.
Well, I just want to say thank you for all this, Andrew. This has been super helpful and really interesting to hear about your backstory working with Tesla and what Volta is currently working on. For those of who are listening, what's the best way for people to kind of find out more about Volta and maybe explore having it at their locations?
Yeah, so like I said, definitely download the app, Volta Charging, in the App Store, and then look at our website, voltacharging.com. I think it's to joke, definitely go drive an electric vehicle. If you don't have one today, go test drive a Model 3, and your world will be changed forever. And then once you have your Model 3, come charge at our station.
Well, great. I think that gives people the right kind of homework that they should be working on. So yeah. I really appreciate your time today and learning about this. So we look forward to talking with you in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks, Chase.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to visit our website, connectingthegrid.com. There you can listen to our podcasts, contact us about sponsorship, or even be a guest on Grid Connections. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a positive rating on your favorite podcast or video streaming service. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about this show, that would help us out a lot too. Thank you again, and I look forward to us learning more together soon.